Welcome to Soft Spoken Mysteries. Tonight, we're exploring two of history's most brutal corners. Corners where daily survival meant enduring conditions so extreme, so physically and psychologically demanding that they broke most who experienced them. In our first investigation, we'll journey to medieval Europe, where one profession stood apart from all others. Not because of its importance or its prestige, but because of what it demanded. The executioner, the man who delivered death on command, who walked through life marked and shunned, living in a twilight world between law and damnation. Then, we'll descend into the darkness of the galley decks, where human beings were chained to rowing benches and transformed into living engines, stripped of their humanity, branded like cattle, forced to row until their bodies gave out, or the sea claimed them. The galley slave, a fate considered worse than death itself. Two roles, two forms of brutal existence, two reminders that history's darkest chapters weren't written with ink. They were written in sweat, blood, and the breaking of human spirits. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey into the shadows where survival itself was an act of endurance. Picture Bavaria in May 1573. A young man named Frantz Schmidt stands in his father's backyard, a sword trembling slightly in his hands. Before him, tied to a post, is a stray dog. This is the final test. He's already practiced on pumpkins, their hollow shells splitting cleanly under the blade. But this is different. This is living flesh, warm blood, the weight of taking life. Frantz is 19 years old, and if he passes this test, he will become what his father is. What his grandfather was, what no one would ever choose to be, an executioner. The blade falls, the test is passed, and Frantz Schmidt's fate is sealed, just as surely as that of any criminal who would one day kneel before his sword. But here's what makes this story so fascinating. We know the details of that morbid scene because Frantz kept diaries, meticulous detailed journals that chronicled his life as an executioner, painting one of the richest pictures we have of this profession during the 16th century. His words reveal something Hollywood never showed us: the humanity behind the violence, the man who took his work seriously, who often felt empathy for his victims, who never wanted this life at all. Because becoming an executioner in medieval Europe was rarely a choice. It was a curse, a stain, a fate that could destroy your entire family for generations. Let's go back to how Frantz's father, Heinrich Schmidt, entered this profession. The year was 1553, the place also Bavaria. Heinrich was just an ordinary man, living an ordinary life. He had no connection to execution, no training in delivering death. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The vicious Bavarian magistrate Albrecht II wanted 3 men hanged, but there was a problem. No executioner was available. Albrecht looked over the assembled crowd of citizens who had gathered to watch the public punishment. His eyes fell on Heinrich Schmidt. "You," Albrecht said, "you will hang these men, or you will hang in their place. What would you do? Face the rope yourself, or become the one who pulls it?" Heinrich chose survival. He performed the execution, and in that moment, his entire life changed. His family's entire future changed. Because once Heinrich Schmidt became an executioner, even by force, no one wanted anything to do with him. He had taken life with his own hands. In the eyes of medieval society, he was contaminated, polluted, something less than human. The stigma was immediate and absolute. Friends turned away, neighbours refused to acknowledge him. Doors that were once open slammed shut. Heinrich Schmidt found himself pushed to the margins of society, living in a shadow world where only other outcasts would associate with him. And his children? They inherited his curse. This is how it worked throughout medieval Europe. The profession of executioner ran through families like a disease. Sons followed fathers to the scaffold not out of desire, but out of necessity. Because who else would marry an executioner's daughter? Who would employ an executioner's son? What guild would accept them? They were trapped, generation after generation bound to a profession that society needed but could never forgive. By the time Frantz graduated from the decapitating dogs in 1573, he was already 18 years old and had been working under his father's supervision for several years. He knew what his life would be. He knew that his dream of becoming a doctor, of healing people instead of killing them, would never come true. The social isolation began immediately. In most medieval towns and cities, executioners and their families were forced to live on the peripheries, well away from respectable neighbourhoods, sometimes near the city walls, sometimes near public lavatories, brothels, and leper colonies. Always separated, always marked. In France, they were known as maîtres de hautes et basses œuvres, masters of high and low works. The name itself reveals the full scope of their duties because being an executioner meant far more than just killing people. It meant being society's dirty worker. The one who handled everything too foul, too degrading, too polluting for respectable citizens to touch. An executioner was expected to tax prostitutes and lepers. If he found an illegal leper begging on the streets, he had the right to confiscate all their belongings and money and to fine them an additional amount. This wasn't mercy. This was exploitation, one of the few ways executioners could supplement their income. They were also knackers. This meant collecting animal carcasses from around town, killing sick or dying animals, rendering the bodies for anything usable. Fat, hides, tallow, bone meal. The smell alone marked them. The stench of death and decay followed executioners wherever they walked. They cleaned cesspools and latrines. They managed gambling houses. They disposed of anything the town needed removed, but no one else would touch. Even in the Ottoman Empire, the role was segregated. No citizen could be an executioner. The vocation was reserved exclusively for Roma gypsies. This fact alone separated them in Ottoman society. They were looked down upon for their cruelty and unflinching approach to all the gruesome tasks. These Roma caravans were essential parts of Ottoman army baggage trains, tasked with the cruelest tortures and executions against subjugated peoples. The Ottoman Roma executioners were widely feared for methods like impalement on a stake, the execution technique used against brigands, thieves, and captured freedom fighters in occupied lands. The kind of death that took hours or even days, the victim slowly sliding down the stake as their own weight drove it deeper. But let's return to Western Europe, to Frantz Schmidt and the daily reality of his work. When he arrived in Nuremberg from Bamberg in 1577, Frantz faced his first execution in his new home. The condemned man's name was Vogel. His crime was burning an enemy to death in a stable. For this, Vogel would be beheaded. Frantz thought back to the irony of the name. Vogel meant bird in German, and if this man were truly repentant, if he faced death with proper Christian humility, perhaps his soul would ascend to heaven like a bird taking flight. This wasn't cruel mockery. This was how executioners had to think. Because their role, as medieval society understood it, was fundamentally about atonement, about giving condemned criminals the chance to make peace with God before the final moment. Before the execution, Vogel would have received visitors, family members perhaps, sometimes even relatives of his victims, seeking reconciliation. This was encouraged. The condemned who accepted oranges and gingerbread from his victim's widow showed he had forgiven and been forgiven. It was a sign that divine justice would be balanced with earthly punishment. Most visitors were clergy, priests who would hear final confessions, who would pray with the condemned, who would try to prepare their souls for judgment. This was essential, because a good execution wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul. The executioner had to be ready at precise times. The morning of an execution meant rising early, preparing equipment, ensuring everything was in perfect order. A dull blade could turn a clean beheading into a butchery, and that would be disaster. Not disaster for the condemned, who would already be beyond caring after the first blow. Disaster for the executioner. Because executions were public spectacles, crowds gathered to watch. Sometimes hundreds of people, sometimes thousands. They came to see justice served, to see the wages of sin, to witness the moral lesson that crime would be punished. But they also came with expectations. They expected competence. They expected a clean, quick death. They expected the condemned to have their final moments of dignity before the blade fell. If an executioner botched the job, the crowd could turn violent. In some German towns, an executioner was permitted 3 strikes before the crowd would intervene. 3 attempts to sever the head. If the 4th blow was still required, the mob would sometimes grab the executioner and force him to die in place of the poor sinner he had failed to execute properly. 3 strikes, that was the rule. That was the margin for error. Frantz Schmidt recognized this constant danger to his life in every execution. But through skill or luck or both, he only faced 1 total breakdown in public order during his entire career. A flogging that turned into a riot and fatal stoning, and even that came long after his journeyman years. His success came from preparation, from treating his work as a craft requiring precision and care, from understanding that each execution was a performance in the worst possible sense of the word. The day of the execution would follow a strict ritual. First, the court condemnation. The prisoner would be brought before the judges one final time. The scribe would read the final confession and its tally of offences, concluding with the formulaic condemnation, which being against the laws of the Holy Roman Empire, my lords have decreed and given sentence that he shall be condemned from life to death. Then the method would be specified. By rope, by sword, by fire, by water, by the wheel, that was the worst. Breaking on the wheel meant having your limbs systematically shattered with an iron bar, then being left to die slowly as your broken body was woven through the spokes of a cartwheel and raised up for public display. It could take days to die. Starting with the youngest juror, the judge would poll all 12 for their consent. Each would give the standard reply. What is legal and just pleases me. Before confirming the sentence, the judge would address the condemned directly for the first time, inviting a statement. The poor sinner was not expected to present any defence. That time had passed. Instead, he was expected to thank the jurors and judge for their just decision, to absolve them of any guilt in the violent death they had just endorsed. Then came the death procession. The condemned would be led through the streets from the prison to the place of execution. Sometimes a priest would walk beside them. Sometimes the executioner himself would support their steps. This was mercy in its own way, helping someone walk to their own death. The crowd would line the streets. Some would throw things, rotten vegetables, stones, refuse. Some would curse, some would pray. The condemned was encouraged to pray aloud, to ask for forgiveness from God and from the community. By the time they reached the scaffold, everyone present understood their role in this theatre of horror. The executioner, the condemned, the crowd, the clergy, each had their part to play in this carefully choreographed drama of religious redemption. The executioner would position the condemned. For a beheading, this meant kneeling, head on the block or leaning forward if the execution was by sword. The position had to be exact. The neck exposed at precisely the right angle, a quick prayer, a final blessing, and then the executioner would raise his blade. This is where technical skill separated the professional from the butcher. A clean beheading required understanding anatomy, understanding the mechanics of the blade, understanding exactly where to strike, the space between the vertebrae, the angle that would allow the sword to pass through cleanly, severing the spinal column without getting caught on bone. Frantz Schmidt developed this understanding through practice and study. He treated hundreds of patients in his unofficial capacity as a healer and physician. He understood human anatomy better than most doctors of his time. This knowledge made him more effective at both healing and killing. Over the course of his career, Frantz performed 361 executions and 345 minor punishments, floggings, ear amputations, finger removals, each meticulously recorded in his diaries, each remembered not as a faceless criminal, but as a person with a name and a crime and a final moment. He wrote about a man executed for theft, about a woman drowned for infanticide, about bands of robbers broken on the wheel, about counterfeiters beheaded, about arsonists burned alive at the stake. The punishments fit the crimes, as medieval justice understood it. Thieves lost the hands that stole, blasphemers lost the tongues that cursed God. Those who killed by burning would die by fire. But here's what Frantz's diaries reveal that's so important. Behind every execution, he saw a human being. He recorded not just their crimes, but sometimes the circumstances that led to those crimes. Poverty, desperation, mental illness, though they had no such term for it then. He couldn't save them. That wasn't his role, but he could bear witness. He could remember them as people, not just as criminals. The psychological toll of this work was immense. Joseph de Maistre, writing in the 18th century, captured the public perception of executioners with this observation. This head, this heart, are they made like ours? Do they not have something odd or foreign to our nature? On the exterior, he is made just as we are. He is born like us, but he is an extraordinary being. Is he a man? This was how medieval people saw executioners, as something other than human, as creatures who could do what normal people could not and would not do. But the truth was different. Executioners were human. They had hopes and fears and dreams like anyone else. They loved their families. They took pride in their work when they could. They struggled with the moral weight of taking life, even when that life was forfeit by law. They simply had no choice in their profession. The isolation was crushing. Even when executioners were off duty, they had to be recognizable. In many places, they were required to wear special clothing, distinctive hats, particular colors, markings that identified them the way Jews, lepers, and prostitutes were also forced to mark themselves. They couldn't enter certain establishments. Churches often barred them, though some churches set aside special pews in the back where executioners could worship in segregation. Bathhouses refused them. Taverns turned them away. Markets might allow them to buy food, but only at certain times when decent people weren't present. Their children couldn't attend regular schools. They couldn't apprentice to guilds. They couldn't marry into respectable families. The executioner's daughter might be beautiful, kind, educated. It didn't matter. She was tainted by her father's profession. Even in death, the separation continued. Executioners and their families couldn't be buried in regular graveyards. Their graves were set apart, marked, much less elaborate than those of ordinary citizens. Simple rough stones, uncarved, unpolished. Located at the edges of burial grounds, as if even in death they needed to be kept at a distance. The biggest of these executioners' graveyards is part of the Ayıp Cemetery in Istanbul. Hundreds of men who served the Ottoman Empire, their bodies finally at rest, still segregated from those they served. But there were exceptions, rare cases where executioners managed to break through the barriers of social status. Frantz Schmidt was one of these exceptional cases. His notable professionalism, his careful records, his obvious competence, and his attempts to also serve as a healer led to his appointment as the official executioner of Bamberg. This was a prestigious position. It came with a generous salary and allowed him to live a very comfortable life with his family in a large home. He succeeded where most executioners could only dream of success. But even his success couldn't erase the stigma attached to his profession. In his later years, Frantz Schmidt spent considerable time and effort petitioning the authorities, not for himself, for his children. He wanted to release them from the family curse. He wanted them to have the lives he never could. And remarkably, he succeeded. His children were released from the obligation to follow in his footsteps. The generational curse of the Schmidt family was broken, but for every Frantz Schmidt who managed to elevate his position, there were thousands of executioners who lived and died in isolation and shame. In France, the Sanson family provided 6 executioners between 1688 and 1847, generation after generation, sons following fathers to the scaffold. The Deibler dynasty provided 5 executioners between 1879 and the abolition of capital punishment in 1981. These weren't choices, these were inheritances no one wanted. The pay from executions alone was never enough to live on, because executions, despite popular imagination, were relatively rare. A busy executioner might perform a dozen executions in a year, an average one perhaps only 3 or 4. This is why executioners supplemented their income with all those other unsavoury tasks: the knacker work, the cesspool cleaning, the taxing of prostitutes and lepers. Some executioners, particularly in England, were paid per execution and also allowed to keep the clothes and possessions of the executed. This created perverse incentives. An executioner might prefer a wealthy criminal who owned good clothing over a poor one in rags. The tools of their trade were their own responsibility. Swords had to be kept sharp, perfectly balanced, properly maintained. Ropes had to be tested for strength. Wheels and other implements of torture had to be constructed and repaired. All of this cost money, and all of it came from the executioner's pocket. The most successful executioners were those who developed other skills. Medical knowledge was valuable. The same understanding of anatomy that made for clean executions also made for effective healing. Many executioners became unofficial physicians to those who couldn't afford or access regular doctors. Some became skilled at torture, not as random cruelty, but as an art of extracting confessions without killing the subject. The rack, the thumb screws, the strappado, instruments designed to inflict maximum pain with minimal permanent damage. This required knowledge and skill, and that skill was marketable. But no amount of skill, no amount of professionalism could overcome the fundamental social position of the executioner. They were necessary but contemptible, essential but untouchable. They delivered justice but were themselves beyond justice's protection. If someone attacked an executioner, the punishment was often minimal. After all, what honour could be damaged when the victim had no honour to begin with? What dignity could be violated when society had already stripped them of dignity? This created dangerous situations. Executioners couldn't defend themselves effectively under law. They couldn't seek redress for wrongs done to them. They existed in a legal twilight, protected only by the fact that killing them might mean no one would be available to perform executions. Some turned to alcohol to cope. Some became genuinely cruel, the constant exposure to death and suffering hardening them until they really did become the monsters society believed them to be. Some found strange forms of pride in their work, taking satisfaction in technical excellence, even as they understood they would never be truly accepted. And some, like Frantz Schmidt, tried to hold on to their humanity, writing in their diaries, treating patients, helping the poor, seeking redemption, not for their victims, but for themselves. The medieval executioner lived on the edge of society in every possible way, geographically pushed to the margins of towns, socially shunned by all but the desperate and the damned, psychologically balanced between the need to deliver death efficiently and the human need to see oneself as something other than a killer. They were the men who stood at the intersection of divine and earthly authority, who balanced justice and mercy even as they held the sword, who understood that every life they took was both a legal necessity and a moral weight that would never lift. Frantz Schmidt died in 1634 after decades of service as an executioner. His diary survived him, providing us with one of the most detailed looks into this profession that we have. Through his words we see not a monster, but a man. Not a sadist, but someone trying to do a necessary job with as much humanity as circumstances allowed. His story reminds us that history's brutal roles weren't always filled by brutal people. Sometimes they were filled by ordinary people trapped by circumstance, by birth, by one unlucky moment when a magistrate pointed and said, You will do this, or you will die. And once that choice was made, there was no going back, only forward, into a life lived in shadows, marked and shunned, necessary and despised, until death brought the final release. But there were fates even darker than the executioner's hood, conditions so brutal that execution might have seemed merciful by comparison. Which brings us to our second investigation tonight. We're leaving the scaffold behind and descending into the darkness of the galley decks, where human beings were stripped of their humanity and transformed into living engines, where life was measured in strokes of the oar, and death came from exhaustion, starvation, or the simple mercy of drowning when the ship went down. Welcome to the world of the galley slave, a fate that medieval Europe considered worse than death itself. Picture a galley, not the romantic image of sleek ships cutting through blue Mediterranean waters, not the adventure of ancient explorers. Picture instead what it really was, a floating prison, a torture chamber that moved under human power. Now picture yourself chained to a bench on the lower deck of that galley. You can see perhaps 6 feet in any direction through the gloom. The only light comes from gaps in the deck above and the occasional oil lamp. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, rotting wood, and seawater. You are chained by your ankle to a ring bolted to the deck. Your wrists are free because you need them to grip the oar. That oar is 20 feet long, heavy, rough with splinters. You share it with 5 or 6 other men, all chained to the same bench. Some of them are criminals like you. Some are prisoners of war. Some just had the misfortune to be in the wrong place when slavers came raiding. Above, you, the feet of free rowers, press down on your head level. Below you, the bilge water sloshes with every movement of the ship. That water is foul beyond description. It's where everything drains, waste, vomit, blood. It seeps into any wounds you have. And in this environment, you always have wounds. This is where you will live. This is where you will sleep. This is where you will eat your rations of hard biscuit and beans. This is where you will relieve yourself, because you cannot leave this bench. You are chained here, permanently. This is your entire world now. 6 feet of space, a shared oar, the rhythm of rowing, and the knowledge that most men don't survive more than 2 to 3 years in these conditions. Welcome to life as a galley slave. But before we descend fully into that hell, we need to understand something important. Hollywood lied to you. Films like Ben-Hur created an image of ancient Roman galleys manned by slaves, chained to their oars, whipped to row faster. It's a powerful image. It's also completely false. Ancient Roman and Greek galleys were not powered by slaves. In classical, Hellenistic, and imperial navies, rowers were free men. They were paid professionals, citizens, allies, mercenaries, men who chose this work because it paid well and offered opportunities for advancement. During the 5th century, BC Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, slave owners might send some of their slaves to the navy in time of war, but those slaves were treated the same as free men. They were paid by the day. This was actually one way slaves could earn money to buy their freedom. The Roman Republic and Empire maintained this practice. Rowers on their quinqueremes and warships were recruited as professionals or auxiliaries. They were trained in complex maneuvers like ramming attacks. This required skill and coordination that you simply couldn't get from chained, unwilling slaves. Think about it logically. An ancient Greek trireme had 170 oarsmen. If any one of those oarsmen missed a beat, the boat would immediately become dead in the water. All the oars on one side would clash and many would break. The mobility and speed of these vessels resulted from extreme precision in rowing. You couldn't achieve that with slaves. There were exceptions in extreme emergencies. After the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, when Rome suffered catastrophic losses, slaves were armed and equipped and promised freedom for service, including potential rowing duties. But this was crisis management, not standard practice. Ancient rowers were also expected to fight when necessary. Naval combat often ended in boarding actions, with the crews clashing hand to hand on deck. You couldn't risk giving weapons to slaves who might use them against you. You needed loyal, trained, motivated men. The ancient world understood this. Galleys were too important, too valuable, too tactically crucial to trust to forced labour. So they paid their rowers, and they paid them well. But then something changed. The medieval period brought new attitudes, new economic pressures, new technologies of control, and somewhere around the 15th century, the galley slave emerged as a permanent feature of Mediterranean naval warfare. The shift happened gradually. By the late Middle Ages, Christian and Muslim powers in the Mediterranean were locked in constant warfare and piracy. Every battle, every raid produced captives, thousands of them. These captives had value, but not as much value as they might have had in earlier times. The labour market had changed. Agriculture was less labour-intensive in some regions. Domestic slavery was expensive to maintain. But navies needed rowers, and rowing required muscle rather than skill. The economic calculation became brutal and simple. Why pay free men when you could use captives who cost nothing but their minimal food? France appears to have been one of the first to formally establish the system. Traces of the practice appear as early as 1532, but the first legislative enactment came in the Ordonnance d'Orléans of 1561. This made it legal to sentence criminals to row in war galleys. In 1564, Charles IX of France forbade sentencing prisoners to the galleys for fewer than 10 years. 10 years minimum, because that's how long they needed to get useful work from you before your body gave out. Condemned galley slaves in France were branded. The fleur-de-lis marked them as French prisoners. The letter fille for voleur, meaning thief, and gal literally identifying them as galley slaves. These brands were seared into their shoulders with hot iron, permanent marks of their status and their sentence. Those who fled military service received even more brutal treatment. Their ears and noses were cut off before they were chained to the oars. Mutilation as punishment and as warning. Your body became a testament to your crimes, visible for all to see. Venice developed its own system. Initially, they tried something like compulsory military service. In times of war, citizens were obliged to serve in Venetian galleys. But this wasn't sustainable. Citizens resented forced service. They weren't trained rowers. The system failed. So Venice switched to using prisoners, just like other Mediterranean powers. But with a Venetian twist, instead of using their own criminals exclusively, they preferred to use captured Turks, enemy slaves powering the ships that would fight their nations. There was cruel logic to it. These men would never be released. They had no hope of freedom, so they might as well be worked to death. The Ottoman Empire, meanwhile, used Christian captives, Muslims enslaved in constant raids and naval battles. Whole communities on Mediterranean coasts lived in terror of Turkish pirates, who would sweep in, capture everyone they could, and drag them away to lives at the oars. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 illustrates the scale. When the Christian fleet defeated the Ottoman Turks, 12,000 Christian galley slaves were freed. 12,000 men chained to Turkish galleys, rowing for their captors, many of them for years. But those 12,000 were the lucky ones. They were freed because their side won. For every freed slave, there were others who went down with their ships, chained to the benches, drowning in the darkness as the sea rushed in. Let's return to the experience itself, to what daily life as a galley slave really meant. You would be captured first, of course, maybe in battle, maybe in a raid on your village, maybe you were convicted of a crime and sentenced to the galleys. The how didn't matter. The result was the same. You would be stripped of your possessions. Your clothes would be taken. You might be left in nothing but a loincloth, or completely naked depending on the fleet. This was practical, not cruelty. Clothes rot in the damp conditions of a galley. Naked slaves are easier to hose down when the stench becomes unbearable. Then came the branding. Hot iron pressed to your flesh, the smell of burning skin, the searing pain. You would wear that brand for the rest of your life, however long that might be. Then you would be brought to the ship and taken below decks, into the darkness, into the world you would never leave, except as a corpse. The chains went on quickly, iron shackles around your ankle, locked to a ring on the deck. The metal was cheap, rough, unfinished, just part of the galley's fittings, like any other equipment. You were equipment now, a human motor, nothing more. They positioned you at your oar, showed you how to grip it, explained the rhythm. Then the overseer with his whip made sure you understood. When the drum beat, you rode. When it stopped, you rested. Miss the rhythm, feel the whip. The oar itself was massive, 20 feet long in many galleys, so heavy that it took several men just to lift it. The handle was worn smooth from thousands of hands before yours, dark with sweat and grime and blood. The rowing position was specific. Sit on the bench, feet braced against the deck or the bench ahead. Grip the oar with both hands. When the drum beat, pull. Lean back with your whole body. Drive with your legs. Pull until the oar blade completed its stroke through the water. Then push forward again, ready for the next stroke, again and again and again and again. Hour after hour, the drum beating. The overseer walking between the benches, his whip ready for anyone who faltered. The rhythm was everything. If one bench missed its timing, the whole ship suffered. Oars would clash, blades would tangle, forward motion would stop, and that couldn't be allowed. So the whip enforced the rhythm, stroke after stroke after stroke. Your hands would blister within the first day. Within a week, those blisters would tear open and bleed. Eventually, if you survived long enough, thick calluses would form, but they would split open regularly, especially in the salt water, and split calluses became wounds, and wounds in this environment became infected. The chains around your ankles created constant sores. The metal rubbed against flesh with every movement. Your skin would wear away. Raw, weeping ulcers would develop where the shackle made contact. These sores would never heal because the chains never came off, and the environment was filthy. If those sores became infected, you would die. Slowly, fever, delirium, your body consuming itself as infection spread through your bloodstream. You would keep rowing until you couldn't anymore, until you slumped over the oar, and then they would unlock your chains and throw your body overboard and chain another man in your place. The food was minimal, hard biscuit, beans, maybe some salted fish if the ship was well provisioned, but never enough. You were always hungry. Your body was burning thousands of calories each day rowing, and you were being fed maybe half of what you needed. You would waste away gradually, muscle turning into sinew stretched over bone. But water they gave you freely. This seems like mercy, but it wasn't. It was economics. The administrators of galley fleets realized that slaves died quickly of dehydration, much quicker than starvation. So it was cheaper to carry vast quantities of fresh water than to constantly replace dead rowers. You could drink as much as you wanted, but that water came from barrels that had been sitting in the heat, sometimes for weeks. It was brackish, foul, but you drank it anyway, because the alternative was dying of thirst while surrounded by seawater you couldn't drink. Sleep was almost impossible. You slept at your bench in your chains. Your head would rest on your crossed arms over the oar. That was your bed. The man behind you might step on your back when he needed to move. The man ahead of you might do the same. Bodies pressed together in the darkness. No privacy, no comfort, just exhaustion so profound that you could sleep anyway. The waste situation was exactly as horrible as you imagine. You relieved yourself at your bench. There was no other option. The chains didn't allow you to move, so it simply fell to the deck beneath you, joining the bilge water that sloshed back and forth with the ship's motion. That's why the bilge was so foul. It was everyone's waste mixed with seawater, rotting food, dead rats, and anything else that fell through the gaps in the deck. The smell was beyond description, sulphurous, putrid, so thick you could taste it. When other ships approached a galley, they could smell it from hundreds of yards away. The stench of 200 unwashed men, confined in filth, never bathing, rotting alive. Bathing. That's almost funny to even mention. There was no bathing. If the overseer decided the smell had become intolerable, even by galley standards, they might hose the rowers down with seawater. Not for your comfort, for theirs. The free crew couldn't stand the stench anymore. But seawater has salt. Salt in your wounds, salt on your raw skin, salt in your infected sores. The pain of that washing would make you wish they'd just left you in your filth. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. Dysentery, typhus, any infectious disease that appeared on a galley could sweep through the entire rowing deck in days. Men would die in their chains, their bodies left chained to the bench until someone noticed and had them removed. You might be sharing an oar with a corpse for hours before it was dragged away. And the weather. When storms came, life below deck became even worse. Seawater would pour through any gap, soaking everything. The ship would pitch and roll violently. Men would be thrown against their oars, bones breaking. The darkness would be absolute except for lightning flashes, and you would be chained in place, unable to escape, knowing that if the ship foundered, you would go down with it. No chance to swim, no chance to reach the surface, just chains and darkness and water closing over your head. Some galleys were equipped with covers that could be pulled over the rowing ports during storms, but these made conditions even more airless and suffocating. You would choose between drowning slowly from the inside as you suffocated, or drowning quickly if a wave crashed through. Combat was perhaps the most terrifying experience of all. When battle began, you were expected to keep rowing. The ship's survival depended on maneuverability, while the free soldiers fought above you, while arrows and spears flew, while blood dripped through the deck onto your head. You kept rowing, because if the ship lost its ability to move, it would be rammed and sunk. If the ship did sink, you drowned. Chained in place, trapped as the water rose. This happened frequently. Naval battles often resulted in multiple ships going down, hundreds of slaves drowning together in the darkness, their screams unheard above the chaos of battle. If the ship was captured, your fate depended on who won. If your side's enemies took the ship, you might simply become their slave. Different owners, same chains. If your own side retook the ship, you remained exactly where you were, because you were still a slave, still sentenced, still chained. There are documented cases of men spending 10, 15, even 20 years chained to galley oars. Imagine that. 2 decades of this existence, your entire adult life, spent in 6 feet of space, rowing until your body broke. The vast majority didn't last that long. 2 to 3 years was the average lifespan of a galley slave. Not because they were killed, because their bodies simply gave out. Exhaustion, starvation, disease, infection, despair, yes, despair. The psychological toll was immense. You had no hope of release. Your sentence might technically be for 10 years, but nobody tracked this. Nobody cared. Even if you completed your sentence, who would notice? Who would release you? You were equipment. When equipment broke, it was discarded. Some men went mad, screaming, laughing, babbling. They would be beaten until they stopped or died. Madness was not acceptable. It disrupted the rhythm of rowing. Some tried to kill themselves. But how do you kill yourself when you're chained in place under constant supervision with nothing but your own body? Some refused to eat, but the overseers would force-feed them. A dead slave was useless, but a slave who wouldn't work would be beaten until they did. Some tried to provoke their own execution, acting out, attacking overseers, anything to bring a quick end rather than slow dying at the oar. Sometimes this worked, sometimes the overseers simply beat them harder and chained them more securely. The overseer himself was crucial to the system, usually a free man, sometimes a former slave, who had somehow earned a position of authority. His job was to keep the rhythm, maintain discipline, and extract maximum work from exhausted men using minimal resources. He carried a whip or a cane. This was his primary tool of management. Miss a stroke? Feel the whip. Slow down? Feel the cane. Fall asleep? Wake up bleeding. The whip wasn't meant to kill you. That would be wasteful. It was meant to hurt, to remind you that resistance was pointless, to condition you to respond to the drum without thought. Without hesitation, you became an automaton, a machine of flesh and bone, programmed to row. In Southeast Asia, the Iranian and Bangwingwi pirates took this system to even darker depths. Their Lanong and Gare warships were crewed entirely with male galley slaves captured from previous raids. The conditions were so brutal that dying on voyages from exhaustion was routine. These pirates kept slaves bound to their stations continuously. No breaks except when the ship was at rest, no period of recovery, just rowing until the body failed, and when it did fail, the corpse was thrown overboard, and a new slave was chained in place. Most of these slaves were Tagalogs, Visayans, and various peoples the pirates simply categorized as Malays. Some were European, some were Chinese. It didn't matter. Slave was slave. If you could pull an oar, you were useful. When you couldn't anymore, you weren't. The economic logic of galley slavery was brutally simple. Free rowers had to be paid. They had to be housed, fed properly, treated with some basic dignity. They could leave if they found better work. They could organize and demand better conditions. Slaves cost nothing but their capture and their minimal maintenance. They couldn't leave. They couldn't demand anything. They couldn't organize because they were chained in place. If they died, you captured more. The supply seemed endless, but this logic eventually destroyed itself. Because galley warfare was already becoming obsolete, sailing ships with cannon could destroy galleys from range without ever coming close enough for the galleys to use their ramming tactics or their speed. The age of sail made the age of the oar obsolete. France continued using galley slaves until 1715, not because galleys were still effective warships, but because the system was entrenched, because it was convenient, because nobody cared enough about the slaves to end it. The North African Barbary pirates used Christian slaves in their galleys well into the 19th century, long after naval warfare had moved on, long after galleys were militarily irrelevant. They kept using slaves because they could. The system finally ended, not because of mercy, but because of obsolescence. Galleys themselves disappeared from naval warfare, and when there were no more galleys, there was no more need for galley slaves. But for the centuries when the system flourished, it represented one of history's most sustained forms of institutionalized brutality. Not the brutal passion of mob violence, not the brutal efficiency of execution, but the brutal indifference of a system that treated human beings as disposable machinery. Think about what that means. Thousands of men, tens of thousands across the centuries. Each one a person with a name, a family, a life before the chains, each one reduced to this existence, this darkness, this suffering, this slow dying at the oar, and the people who created this system, who maintained it, who profited from it, they weren't monsters. They were administrators, naval officers, government officials, perfectly normal people who simply saw slaves as economic units, rather than human beings. That's the truly dark part. The executioner at least struggled with his role. He knew he was taking life. He felt the weight of it. The galley slave system involved thousands of people who never pulled a chain, never wielded a whip, never saw the suffering they caused. They just kept the system running because it was efficient. We have very few first-hand accounts from galley slaves themselves. Most couldn't write. Most didn't survive to tell their stories. The system consumed them and left almost no record of their individual experiences. But we know they existed. We know they suffered. We have the archaeological evidence, the ships, the chains, the cramped spaces below decks where hundreds of men lived and died. We have the accounts from those who saw the galleys from the outside, the overwhelming stench, the occasional glimpse of the misery below decks, the bodies thrown overboard, and we have a handful of survivors, men who somehow endured, who were freed when their side won a battle, who were released when the system finally ended. Their stories confirm what the physical evidence suggests. It was hell, pure and sustained hell, a form of suffering so profound that death would have been mercy. And yet men survived it, not many, but some. They rode until they were released. They bore the brands and the scars. They carried the psychological weight of those years at the oar for the rest of their lives. Their survival was not triumph. It was simply endurance, the ability to keep pulling the oar one more time, and one more time after that, and one more time after that, until either release came or death did. Tonight we've explored two of history's most brutal roles: the executioner, forced into a profession that marked him and his family for generations, living on the margins of society, necessary but despised, delivering death while struggling to maintain his humanity, and the galley slave, stripped of everything, reduced to a living machine, chained in darkness, rowing until his body broke, or the sea claimed him. Two corners of the past where survival itself was an ordeal, where daily existence meant enduring conditions so extreme they seem almost impossible to modern minds. But they were real. These weren't myths or exaggerations. They were how human beings treated other human beings. Systems of brutality so entrenched they lasted for centuries. Not because people were inherently more cruel than we are today, but because these systems served purposes that society valued more than the suffering they caused. The executioner delivered justice, maintained order, made public examples of criminals. The cost was his soul, his social standing, his family's future. But society needed someone to swing the sword, and so someone did. The galley slave powered the ships that won battles, controlled trade routes, and projected power across the Mediterranean. The cost was their humanity, their health, their lives. But navies needed rowers, and slaves were cheaper than free men, so chains and whips and starvation became tools of naval warfare. Both systems eventually ended, not because humanity suddenly became more enlightened, but because they became unnecessary. Executioners were replaced by more modern methods of capital punishment, and then by the gradual abolition of the death penalty itself in many places. Galley slaves became obsolete when sailing ships and steam power made oar-powered vessels irrelevant. But the fact that these roles existed, that they persisted for so long, that so many people participated in maintaining them, tells us something important about history. The past was not gentle, it was not kind, it did not value individual human dignity the way we claim to today. It was brutal and pragmatic and willing to destroy people in service of larger goals. The executioner who beheaded criminals with a clean stroke, the galley slave who rowed until he collapsed. They were both part of systems that society needed or thought it needed, and so the suffering continued. Understanding this doesn't excuse it, but it does help us see how far we've come and how fragile our current standards of human dignity really are. Because these weren't ancient, primitive societies. Medieval Europe, Renaissance Italy, early modern France. These were advanced civilizations with art and literature and philosophy, and yet they could chain men to oars. They could brand criminals on their shoulders. They could create generational curses that trapped families in professions of death. We look back now and see the brutality clearly. We're horrified by the conditions. We can't imagine treating people that way. But future generations will look back at our time and find their own horrors, their own systems of brutality that we've normalized, their own corners where people suffer in ways we've learnt not to see. That's the lesson here. Not that the past was terrible, and we're better, but that human beings are capable of normalizing almost anything, given the right circumstances and the right justifications. The executioner's family wasn't inherently evil. They were trapped by a system. The galley slave wasn't chained by monsters. He was chained by administrators, following policy. And that's the most unsettling part. These brutalities didn't require brutish people. They just required people who could convince themselves that this was necessary, that this was justice, that this was how things had to be. History's darkest corners aren't filled with monsters. They're filled with people who created systems of suffering and then lived within those systems until they seemed normal, until they seemed inevitable, until someone finally asked, "Does it have to be this way?" And the answer turned out to be no. This has been Soft-Spoken Mysteries. Tomorrow night, we'll return with 2 more stories from history's hidden corners. Until then, remember what you've heard tonight. Remember that civilization and brutality can coexist. Remember that the most dangerous evil is often the kind that seems reasonable, necessary, justified. Remember the executioner, trapped in his cursed profession. Remember the galley slave, chained in darkness. Remember that they were human beings just like us. And remember that understanding the past means seeing it clearly, not romanticizing it, not excusing it, but witnessing it, acknowledging it, and learning from it. Sleep well, and be grateful for the freedoms you have that they never knew.